Escape from Island Farm. Written and read by Malcolm Cowper. Otto Voss had never wanted to be a soldier. A gentle, artistic lad from Heidelberg, his ambition had been to study at art school in Munich. Unfortunately, he was growing up in Nazi Germany, and as soon as he reached the age of 18, he was called up into the army. He dreaded being sent to the Russian front, from which his older brother Klaus had returned -3 toes, lost to frostbite. As he came to the end of his training, it looked as though his nightmare was to be realised. They were ordered onto trains for the Eastern Front. But then, conveniently, the British and American allies invaded Normandy, and his regiment was rushed to the west instead. Otto realised that he would still have to fight, but at least he'd be facing a less barbaric enemy. A nation that had given the world Mickey Mouse could not be that bad, and Britain, ruled by a fat old alcoholic who smoked cigars all day long, according to the newspapers, held few fears for him. 3 days later, they were in Falaise, fighting to hold back the invaders. The next 2 weeks were the worst in Otto's life. Day and night they were bombed and shelled, and the constant noise of gunfire nearly drove him demented. He lived in a continual state of terror, but his ordeal came to an abrupt end when, on a night reconnaissance patrol, he found himself surrounded by British soldiers. Thankfully, he threw down his rifle, raised his hands in the air, and was led away to join several hundred other prisoners in a holding camp. The following day, they were marched to Arromanches, put on board a troop ship, and taken across the Channel to Dover. There they boarded a train to an unknown destination. Otto was pleasantly surprised to be travelling in a carriage rather than the cattle truck he had expected, even though they were packed 10 to a compartment, and he had to lie on the luggage rack. He noticed that on the walls of the compartment were pictures of places of interest and maps of something called the Great Western Railway. But he also noticed that one of his companions was removing the map from its frame and putting it in his pocket. "So we can escape," was the curt reply he received when he asked why he was doing this. The journey seemed interminable. All the stations had had their name boards removed, so nobody knew where they were. Every so often they would be shunted into a siding so that a military train could speed past. Finally, after about 18 hours, they came to a halt and were ordered out of the train. As they alighted, they heard an announcer say, "Bridgend, Bridgend." This meant nothing to any of them. Outside the station, they were lined up and ordered to march. It was a relief to be moving their cramped legs. It was mid-afternoon, and they were aware of hostile stares from the local people as they marched up the main street, and there was the occasional shout of, "You're losing the war, Jerry!" They were relieved to arrive at their destination, Island Farm prisoner of war camp. The camp consisted of some 50 long, single-storey concrete buildings. But what surprised them as they entered was that instead of having a long barrack room with beds down each side, the huts were divided into small rooms with 3 bunks to each room. What they did not know was that Island Farm had been built not as a prison camp, but as a hostel for workers in a nearby munitions factory, and the rooms had been individual bedrooms. However, the workers, many of whom travelled up to 30 miles each day, did not want to live in these rather austere premises, but preferred to go home to their families. The authorities decided, therefore, to turn it into a prison camp and erected a barbed wire fence round the perimeter. Otto was more than happy to sit out the rest of the war in the place of relative safety. Despite Nazi propaganda, he knew that it was lost. It was only a matter of time before he would be heading back to Germany and his family. However, this was not a view shared by some of his fellow prisoners, a few of whom were hardcore Nazis. Chief of these was Obersturmbannführer Ludwig Heilmann, formerly of the Waffen-SS, who insisted that it was the duty of every soldier to try to escape and fight for the Führer. He called Otto and the other new arrivals together and told them that a tunnel was being dug and they would be expected to contribute to the work. When one foolish soul asked what was the point, since Germany was losing the war, Heilmann grabbed him by the throat and said he would beat him to death if he was ever heard again to be uttering such defeatist nonsense. Heilmann and his gang of SS men were in charge of organising this escape. Otto was pleased to learn that he would not be involved in the digging. That was left to the former miners among them, who were used to that kind of work. Instead, he was given a somewhat unusual task to use his artistic skills to paint naked or skimpily clad ladies on the walls of the huts. The purpose was to distract the guards away from the area where the tunnelling was taking place. He had no difficulty in obtaining paint and brushes, the commandant being only too willing to provide any resources to keep the prisoners occupied. Otto's other jobs, again employing his artistic skills, were forging identity cards for the escapees and making copies of the railway maps stolen from the carriages. The ID cards were copied from authentic documents which had been easily obtained from the guards, either purchased in exchange for cigarettes or chocolate from Red Cross parcels, or stolen. Island Farm was not a difficult camp to break out from. In a purpose-built prison camp, the huts would have been well away from the perimeter fence, whereas at Island Farm they were only a few metres away. There were no watchtowers or searchlights, and the guards were mainly reservists or men not fit for active service. They were only too pleased to go and view Otto's paintings, and were thus kept well away from Hut 9, from which the tunnel was being dug. The escape was planned for the night of the 10th of March 1945. It was decided that it would be impossible for all 2,000 prisoners to escape, so it was agreed that 50, chosen by lottery, would go out. This was thought to be the number who would have got out by the time the alarm was raised. However, they had reckoned without the incompetence of the guards, and when they realised that the escape had not been discovered, they decided that more could escape. Heilmann and his henchmen ran through the huts, dragging men out of bed and ordering them to join in the escape. One of these was Otto, whose relief at not being chosen to escape turned to horror as he realised that he was going to have to go after all. His only disguise was a British Army greatcoat. Having no identity cards or other documentation, he was very unlikely to get very far, and indeed he managed to be at liberty for less than 24 hours. He was discovered lurking in a barn near Southerndown, 4 miles away, tired, cold and hungry, but immensely relieved to be taken back to the safety of the camp. Within a week, all 70 escapees had been recaptured. Some had gone as far as Southampton, having stolen a car belonging to a doctor in Merthyr Road. When it failed to start, a group of off-duty camp guards, walking back from the pub, very kindly gave them a push, and off they went. They continued until the petrol ran out, then jumped on a goods train, but were arrested as they tried to leave the freight yard. A few weeks later, on the 8th of May, Germany surrendered. Soon Otto was on a train back to Heidelberg, where, to his amazement, he was greeted on his arrival as a war hero. The news of the escape bid had reached all the German national newspapers, which, desperate for a success story, had greatly exaggerated the event, and the escapees were being feted as examples of the indomitable spirit of German soldiers. Little did they realise how unwillingly Otto had participated and how pathetically brief had been his period of liberation. Still, he never had to buy a beer for the next few months, and why should he complain about that?